I didn't think it would come to this. Standing outside my own son's door, realizing I am no longer welcome in the house I once helped build with my own hands. The silence he left behind felt heavier than any argument we ever had. It wasn't anger in his eyes that hurt me the most. It was certainty, as if someone had already rewritten his heart, and I had become a stranger inside it. He didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. He simply said that she didn't feel comfortable with me being around anymore. And in that moment, I understood something that no father ever wants to understand too early. Love can sometimes become a wall between the people who once stood closest to each other. My son, the boy I raised with discipline, ambition, and endless questions about the world, looked at me as if I was the disturbance in his future peace. Not the protector, not the guide, just an obstacle. And yet, even as I walked away that night, I kept asking myself one question that refuses to leave me alone. What kind of love makes a son turn his back on his own father before the marriage has even begun? Like if you believe love should never erase family. Subscribe if you believe a father's voice still matters in a son's life. Tell me where you are watching from, because distance never changes the weight of truth. Tell me what time it is where you are, because some thoughts arrive differently depending on the hour of your life. And share this with someone who needs to remember that love should never demand isolation. You see, I have lived long enough to understand that love is never just a feeling. It is a negotiation between truth and illusion, between who we are and who we pretend to be for someone else. And when I look at my son now, I don't just see a man in love. I see a man slowly learning to replace one identity with another, without fully realizing what he might be giving up in the process. She entered his life like certainty often does, quiet, convincing, and absolute. There was nothing dramatic about it at first, no obvious warning signs. In fact, I remember thinking she had a calmness about her that could either mean emotional maturity or something far more calculated. But fathers are not allowed to speak too early. We are expected to observe, to remain patient, to trust that our concerns are just outdated instincts fighting against a new generation's version of love. But I have seen enough relationships in my life to know that love does not always announce its intentions honestly. My son began changing slowly. At first it was harmless, less time at home, more private conversations, a growing distance that he called focus. Then it became boundaries, then it became requests. And finally, it became a quiet demand that I step back from his personal life because she felt uncomfortable with my presence, with my questions, with my opinions. And I am not blind to how that sounds. A father questioning a relationship is never popular. It always appears controlling to those who are inside the relationship. But what people often forget is that fathers do not only see the smile, we notice the silence between the smiles. We do not only hear the words, we listen to what is being carefully avoided. There was a moment, just a few weeks before I was asked to leave, when I saw something in her eyes that I cannot fully describe. Not hatred, not warmth either, something more strategic, as if she was always evaluating, always measuring, always deciding how much of me could be tolerated before I became unnecessary to his future. And maybe that is what hurts the most. Not that I was pushed away, but that it felt intentional in a way that my son could not yet see. I tried to speak to him once, calmly. I asked him a simple question, not about her character, not about her past, not about suspicion. I asked him what kind of peace he believed love should bring into his life, because love, real love, does not isolate a man from his roots. It does not ask him to erase the people who built his foundation. It expands him. It does not shrink his world until only one voice remains. He didn't answer. Not because he didn't hear me, but because he was already defending something he believed was sacred. And that is where I felt the shift. Not in her presence, but in his certainty. Have you ever watched someone you love defend something you are not allowed to question anymore? Have you ever felt your words become meaningless, not because they are wrong, but because they are no longer welcome? Have you ever realized that love can make someone stop listening to the very people who understand them best? Have you ever stood in silence while someone you raised begins to see you as interference instead of family? Because that is what I felt in my own home. The night I was asked to leave, I noticed something small that I cannot forget. My son did not look at me for long. Not because he was cruel, but because looking at me longer might have reopened something he was trying very hard to close, and she stood beside him, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a stillness that felt rehearsed, as if the conclusion had already been agreed upon before I even entered the room. I remember asking him if this was truly his decision, not hers, his, and he paused, just long enough for me to see the answer before he gave it. Yes, he said, but it wasn't the confidence of truth, it was the weight of alignment. I left without raising my voice, because a father does not need to win an argument to understand when he is being removed from a story he once helped write. But as I stepped outside, I realized something even more unsettling. I was not only being pushed out of a house, I was being pushed out of a future I had always assumed I would still be part of. And that is when I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. Because just before the door closed completely, I heard her say something to him in a voice so quiet that I was not supposed to hear it, and what she said changed the way I began to see everything that had happened before that moment. I kept replaying those words in my mind long after I left the house, as if my memory refused to accept what my ears had already heard. The door had almost closed, but not before I caught the faintest trace of her voice. It was not loud, it was not emotional, it was controlled in a way that made it feel even more deliberate. She said, "He will understand you better once you are not confusing him anymore." That was it, a single sentence. But it did not sound like a suggestion. It sounded like a conclusion she had already been working toward long before I ever became aware of it. And in that moment, standing outside my own home with the night air pressing against my face, I felt something I have not felt in a very long time. Not fear, not anger, something more unsettling. Recognition. Because I have seen this pattern before in life. Not always in love, not always in marriage, but in influence. In the slow rewriting of perception, in the quiet removal of one voice so that another becomes the only voice that remains. And my son, he was not a child anymore. He was a man standing at the center of a decision he believed he made freely, but I could see the seams. I walked that night without knowing where I was going. The streets were empty enough for my thoughts to speak louder than the world around me. And the more I thought about it, the more I began to separate what I had observed from what I had been told to accept. There was a shift in him that began long before I was asked to leave. It started in conversations that used to be open and became selective. Then selective became edited. Then edited became delayed. And finally, delayed became avoided entirely. It is strange how silence can become a language between people who once spoke freely. I remember one evening before everything broke open, I tried to talk to him about something simple. Not relationships, not her, just life. The direction he was taking, the pressure he was under, the choices he was making in private that I no longer had access to. He looked at me, and for a moment I saw my son again, not the version shaped by ambition or external voices, but the boy who used to ask me questions that had no easy answers, and I thought maybe I still had a place in his inner world. But then his phone vibrated on the table, and everything in his face changed before he even looked at it. It was not the notification itself that mattered. It was the reflex, the immediate emotional alignment that followed it. As if whatever was on the other side of that screen had more weight than the conversation in front of him. He didn't even apologize. He just shifted, subtly at first, then completely. And I remember thinking, this is how distance begins. Not with conflict, but with interruption. After I left the house, I did something I am not proud of. I did not confront him again immediately. I observed instead, from a distance that fathers are not supposed to cross, but sometimes are forced into when they no longer feel included in the truth of their own family. I noticed how his posture changed when she was present. Not in an obvious way. It was subtle, a kind of internal alignment, as if he was constantly adjusting himself to remain in harmony with her emotional state. And I began to wonder when exactly he stopped asking himself what he felt without her interpretation of it. Have you ever watched someone slowly stop belonging to themselves? Have you ever seen a man convinced that detachment from his past is the same thing as emotional maturity? Have you ever seen love become so dominant that it starts deciding who gets to speak and who gets to remain silent? Because that is what I was beginning to see, but still, I did not want to believe it entirely. Fathers are not designed to give up on their children's judgment too easily. We resist conclusions because we understand how easily young certainty can be mistaken for wisdom. So I decided to meet her properly, not as a test, not as a confrontation, just to understand what I might be missing. It was a simple setting, a quiet place, neutral enough to avoid influence, I thought. She arrived on time, perfectly composed, no nervousness, no visible uncertainty. She greeted me with respect that felt carefully measured, as if she had already decided how much respect the situation required. We spoke about ordinary things first, life, values, plans. Her answers were precise, almost too precise. There was no emotional wandering, no spontaneous reflection, no hesitation that reveals authenticity. It felt like she had rehearsed understanding rather than lived it. And then I asked her a simple question, not about her intentions with my son, not about her past, not even about marriage directly. I asked her what she believed love should do to a man over time. She paused, just slightly, not long enough for suspicion to form, but long enough for me to notice that she was selecting from prepared interpretations. And then she said something I will not forget. She said, "Love should help a man become clearer about who deserves access to him." There was no warmth in that answer, no softness. It was structured like a philosophy, not a feeling. And I realized in that moment that she was not speaking about love as something shared. She was speaking about love as something managed, controlled access, controlled influence, controlled proximity, and I began to understand the direction this was heading. When I returned home that day, my son was already waiting for me, or perhaps not waiting for me specifically, but for the conversation he knew I would eventually bring back into the space she now occupied. He looked tired, not physically, mentally, as if every interaction now required him to balance multiple interpretations of the same reality. And I asked him one question, only one. Do you feel more like yourself since she entered your life, or less? That question did something I did not expect. He did not answer immediately. He looked away, and in that pause I saw something fragile beneath his certainty, not doubt about her, but discomfort about the question itself, because some questions do not attack beliefs. They attack the structure that holds them in place. And then he said something that surprised even me. He said, "You don't understand how much noise there was before she helped me focus." Noise. That word stayed with me, because I began to wonder what he now considered noise. Was it confusion? Or was it disagreement? Was it emotional complexity? Or was it any voice that did not align with the direction he was being guided toward? And I realized something that unsettled me more than anything so far. He was not just choosing a partner, he was choosing a lens through which to interpret the entire world. And I, as his father, was slowly being reframed inside that lens as interference. That night, I stood alone in the quiet of my thoughts and tried to separate concern from paranoia. But fathers do not create suspicion out of nothing. Suspicion grows where familiarity begins to fade without explanation. And then something happened that pushed everything further than I expected. I received a message from him, short, direct, no warmth. He asked me not to contact her directly anymore. Not because she had asked, because it was better for peace. And in that sentence I heard something I did not want to hear. Not a boundary, a replacement, because boundaries are mutual, but replacement is directional. I did not reply immediately. I sat with it, and the more I sat with it, the more I began to see a pattern that I could no longer ignore. Every disagreement was being reframed as disturbance. Every question was becoming interference. Every emotional concern was becoming a threat to peace. And peace, in this new structure, did not seem to include me. I tried to remember when love started to look like this, when it started requiring isolation instead of integration, when it stopped expanding a man's world and started narrowing it to only what confirmed his current emotional alignment, and I could not find the moment, only the progression. The next time I saw him, it was brief, almost mechanical. He was polite but distant in a way that felt rehearsed, and I realized then that I was no longer speaking to him freely. I was speaking to him through filters I could not see, and that is a dangerous place for any father to stand, because when a son stops responding to truth directly, you begin to wonder who is translating it for him, and more importantly, why. That night, after he left, I found something in the house that made me stop completely, something that should not have been there, something that was never part of our life before. And when I held it in my hand, I finally understood that what I had been sensing was not just emotional distance, it was structure. And behind structure, there is always intent I had not fully uncovered yet. When I held it in my hand, I didn't immediately understand what I was looking at. It was small, ordinary at first glance, something that could easily be dismissed as irrelevant if you were not paying attention, but fathers rarely dismiss things too quickly when their instincts have already been disturbed for too long. There was a familiarity to it that made me pause longer than I should have, not because of what it was, but because of where it had been placed. It had not been left carelessly, it had been positioned, and that difference matters more than most people realize. I sat down without realizing I had moved. The house around me felt different now, not physically different, but emotionally reorganized, as if I was no longer in the same version of it I had lived in for years. That is what gradual exclusion does. It does not remove you suddenly. It rearranges everything until your presence feels slightly out of place in a structure you helped build. I finally looked closer. It was a printed set of messages, not recent ones, carefully selected, curated, almost, as if someone had decided which parts of reality I was allowed to see and which parts I was not supposed to question. And as I read the first few lines, I felt something tighten in my chest. They were conversations between my son and her. But not casual conversations. They were directional, not emotional in the way love usually is, but instructional in tone. Subtle guidance disguised as reassurance, corrections disguised as care, interpretations of people and events that consistently led him toward a single conclusion. Distance yourself from anything that creates emotional conflict, including me. I read one line where she said something like, "He doesn't understand your future the way I do. That's why it feels heavy when he speaks." And my son responded not with argument, but with agreement. That was the moment something inside me shifted from concern into clarity. Because disagreement can be worked through, but agreement with reinterpretation of someone's intentions, that is different. That is restructuring. I sat there for a long time, not because I didn't understand what I was seeing, but because I did. And understanding something does not always bring comfort. Sometimes it removes it entirely. Have you ever realized you were not losing someone all at once, but piece by piece, through conversations you were never included in? Have you ever felt a relationship change shape without ever witnessing the moment it changed direction? Have you ever tried to find yourself inside a story that no longer includes your perspective? Because that is what it felt like. And I want to be honest about something that fathers rarely admit openly. We do not fear losing control. We fear losing access to truth. Because without truth, love becomes something we are forced to interpret through silence. I didn't confront him immediately. Not because I was unsure, but because I needed to understand how deep this went. So I did something that I know many would question. I waited. I observed again, not from suspicion anymore, but from necessity. And what I saw over the following days confirmed something I did not want to accept too quickly. Every time my son spoke about decisions involving his life, there was a pattern, a subtle pause before conclusion, as if he was checking an internal reference before finalizing his own thoughts. And whenever disagreement or complexity emerged, the resolution was always the same. He would withdraw inward, then return with certainty that did not feel entirely his own. It is difficult to explain to someone who has not lived long enough to recognize the difference between conviction and guided conviction. Conviction grows from experience. Guided conviction grows from reinforcement. And reinforcement, when repeated consistently, can feel identical to truth, until it is tested. I finally decided to speak to him again, not as a father trying to correct him, not as someone trying to reclaim authority, but as someone trying to understand whether there was anything left of the connection we once had that was still accessible through honesty. He agreed to meet me. That alone told me something had not completely closed. We sat in a quiet place again. But this time the atmosphere was different, not neutral, measured, as if the space itself had become part of the negotiation between two versions of reality. I did not begin with accusation. I began with a question. When did you start feeling like you needed protection from my questions? He exhaled slowly, not annoyed, not defensive at first, just tired in a way that suggested emotional exhaustion from maintaining consistency rather than truth. I don't need protection, he said. But I noticed something immediately. He did not answer the question. He redirected it. And that is often the first sign that someone is no longer engaging directly with what is being asked, but with what they have been prepared to respond to. I leaned forward slightly. Then why do my questions feel like interference to you now? A pause again. This pause was different. Longer. He looked down for a moment, then back up. It's not interference, he said carefully. It's just different priorities now. Priorities. That word is neutral on its surface, but in emotional contexts, neutrality is often used to disguise displacement. I nodded slowly, not to agree, but to allow him space. And then I asked the question I had been avoiding because I already suspected the answer. Do you feel free when you make decisions now, or do you feel guided toward clarity? His expression changed slightly, not anger, recognition, because the question was precise enough that it bypassed rehearsed language. For the first time in that conversation, he hesitated in a way that felt human rather than structured. I make my own decisions, he said, but this time even he seemed less convinced by his own sentence than by the idea of it, and that is when I realized something I had been circling around for days but had not fully admitted to myself. This was no longer just about a relationship, it was about influence becoming indistinguishable from identity. Have you ever watched someone defend a belief so consistently that you begin to wonder whether they are protecting the belief or themselves from the possibility that it is not entirely theirs? Because that is what I was seeing, and I knew that if I pushed too hard, I would not be heard. Not because he did not love me, but because love was now being filtered through a structure that decided what counted as clarity and what counted as confusion. I changed my approach, not to surrender, but to reach him differently. I am not asking you to choose between me and her, I said quietly. I am asking you whether the version of you making these decisions is still fully accessible to yourself. That landed differently. I could see it. Because that question does not attack a person's relationship, it questions their internal ownership, and ownership is something every human instinctively protects. He leaned back slightly. For the first time, there was discomfort without a prepared response, and then he said something that stayed with me longer than anything else he had said so far. She helps me stay focused on what matters. That's not a bad thing. Focus. Again, that word. Focus is valuable in life, but when focus becomes narrowing instead of sharpening, something important is lost. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I asked one final question. And who decides what matters? Silence. Not just his silence. The kind of silence that expands in a room until even thought feels slowed. He looked at me, and I could see something behind his eyes that I had not seen clearly before. Not confusion, conflict between recognition and acceptance. That is a dangerous internal space for any person to be in, because once you recognize something, you cannot fully unsee it. But once you accept something, you must decide what it cost you. And he was standing between those 2 points. The conversation ended shortly after that, not because it was resolved, but because it had reached a boundary neither of us could safely cross in that moment. When I left, I did not feel victorious. I felt something heavier, responsibility. Because understanding what is happening is not the same as knowing how to stop it without breaking what you are trying to protect. Days passed. Distance increased again, but differently this time. Not emotional distance alone, structural distance. I was no longer part of discussions about his life unless necessary. My presence was no longer spontaneous. It was scheduled, controlled, filtered through emotional permission rather than natural belonging. And that is when I realized something that shifted everything I thought I understood about this situation. This was not about removing me from his life. It was about redefining my role within it, not as a father, but as an external variable. And once someone becomes a variable instead of a relationship, their influence can be calculated, limited, and eventually minimized. That realization did not make me angry. It made me cautious in a way I had not been before. Because caution is what you feel when you understand that emotional dynamics are no longer organic, they are structured. One evening, I received a call from him unexpectedly. His voice was different, not distant, not warm either, balanced in a way that felt like he was trying to maintain emotional neutrality. I need you to understand something, he said. I stayed silent. She is not trying to separate me from you. That sentence mattered more than it appeared, because it was not an explanation. It was a defense of intention, and defenses usually appear when something has already been questioned internally. I am not saying she is, I replied calmly. I am asking you if you feel more open or more contained since she became central in your decisions. Another pause, longer this time. And then he said something that I did not expect. I feel directed, not controlled, not influenced. Directed. That word carries precision. Direction implies purpose beyond the self, and in that moment I knew he had reached a level of awareness that was both progress and risk at the same time, because awareness does not immediately free you. Sometimes it traps you in the necessity of justifying what you already depend on. I closed my eyes for a moment, not out of frustration, out of understanding that the situation had moved beyond simple correction. This was now about choice under awareness, and those are the most fragile kinds of choices. Before the call ended, I said something I had not planned. "I do not fear losing your loyalty," I told him. "I fear you losing the ability to recognize when loyalty stops feeling like your own decision." He did not respond immediately, and then the line went quiet. Not disconnected, just quiet. And I realized something in that silence. He was still there, but not fully present. And that is where I understood the real turning point had not yet arrived. Something deeper was still forming beneath everything I had seen so far, and whatever it was, it had not revealed its final shape yet. After the call ended, I remained seated for a long time without moving. There are moments in a father's life when silence is no longer empty. It becomes a place where realization gathers itself slowly, without asking for permission. I kept thinking about the word he used, directed. It stayed in my mind like something unfinished, like a sentence that had been carefully shaped but not fully revealed. Because direction is not always obvious when you are inside it. A river does not question the bank that shapes its path. A mind does not always question the influence that feels like clarity. And love. Love can become the most convincing form of direction when it is not balanced by anything else. I tried to remember my son as he was before all of this. Not the man making decisions under emotional structure, but the boy who used to question everything. He never accepted answers too quickly. He used to break ideas apart just to understand what they were made of. Somewhere along the way, that instinct did not disappear. It became quieter, not gone, just spoken over. And that is what worries me more than anything. Not that he changed, but that his change feels organized rather than natural. Have you ever watched someone you love begin to trust certainty more than understanding? Have you ever seen clarity become a substitute for depth? Have you ever felt a conversation end not because everything was said, but because only one version was allowed to remain? Because that is where I find myself now, standing at the edge of a relationship that still exists, but no longer moves freely in both directions. I do not believe love is supposed to remove influence entirely. That would be unrealistic. Every relationship shapes us in some way. But there is a difference between shaping and replacing, between influence that expands a person and influence that slowly narrows the space in which they think. And as a father, I am left with a responsibility that does not come with instructions. I cannot force clarity into him. I cannot demand he see what I see. I can only remain present enough that if doubt ever returns on its own, it remembers where honesty used to live. I think about her sometimes, not with anger, not with certainty either, but with observation, because intention is not always loud at the beginning. It reveals itself over time, in patterns, in repetition, in the quiet consistency of what is encouraged and what is gradually removed. And I wonder, does she believe she is protecting him or shaping him? Sometimes people cannot tell the difference until much later, when the structure they helped build becomes too strong to question safely. But I will not turn this into conflict. I have learned that conflict rarely creates clarity. It usually hardens positions. What I need now is not a reaction. It is patience with awareness. Because love, real love, does not compete for dominance. It creates space for truth to survive even when it is uncomfortable. And if my son ever reaches a moment where silence feels heavier than direction, I hope he remembers that he once had a father who did not disappear when it became inconvenient to remain present. A father does not always need to be agreed with to still be part of the foundation. He only needs to be remembered clearly enough that truth can find its way back when everything else becomes too structured to breathe. And maybe that is all I can do now. Remain steady, even when everything else is shifting. Because in the end, love is not proven by control or distance or agreement. It is proven by whether, when everything becomes quiet, the heart still knows where it first learned how to recognize truth.